Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'm Kevin Schulman. I'm Director of the Master of Science in Clinical Informatics Management program here at Stanford. And we're really delighted to put on today's webinar looking at the issues of AI in healthcare applications and more broadly. I really want to thank Tatjana Hummel, Veronica Schulte, Lisa Sandoval, and especially James Gillespie for helping us organize this event today. The Master's of Science in Clinical Informatics Management program here at Stanford is entering our fourth year. It's a one-year master's program for working professionals, and you could read more about the program on our website. I am told our applications are open now for cohort 4 for next year. If you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to take them. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who's a graduate of our program, in a second, and then she'll introduce our speakers for tonight. The speakers have some questions, have a presentation and some questions, but if you have a question at any point in time, if you please enter it into the chat, and then Veronica and I will correlate those and bring them back to the panel. So with that, I want to introduce Shishan Yu, who's one of our graduates to the Master of Science in Clinical Informatics program, also a senior leader here at the Stanford Biodesign program, where she works on global partnerships. So let me turn it over. Thank you for joining us tonight, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Disruption in healthcare has historically been difficult, and as we have seen, generative AI may unlock the change. And before we dive deeper into this fascinating world, let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Rohini Kosoglu. Rohini was a former deputy assistant to the president and a domestic policy advisor to the vice president. Currently, she is the policy fellow at Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. We also have Shreya Shah. Shreya is the medical informatics director for primary care and population health, as well as the associate medical director for the Stanford Healthcare AI Applied Research Team. And then finally, we got Dev Dash, and Dev is the clinical assistant professor of emergency medicine. He is also the physician liaison to data science team at Stanford Healthcare. Now I will ask each of our panelists to spend a couple of minutes to talk about their background, collective experience in AI, and also give the key things on their minds when they think about generative AI's impact on healthcare. Let's start with you, Rohini.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think there are so many things to dive into as we think about the role of artificial intelligence in healthcare. I think a big topic of conversation I'm excited to hear everyone talk about is the need for expanded transparency around data sets. What data are models that we're looking at using? What is the geographic potential disparities? What are the racial and ethnic disparities, male to female gender disparities? So there's a lot of things that we know in healthcare already. There are issues about access and who has access in our healthcare system. And so my hope is that, none of this is exacerbated. But I look forward to discussing also just the role that the government has as it watches the private sector flourish. And I think we all hope that there will be a healthy ecosystem where startups and larger companies can both thrive, but also in a way that patients feel protected and that the doctor-patient relationship is protected, and having a good sense of where the information that we are hearing from our decision makers, our clinical decision makers, that they're being used in a way that's very thoughtful, and that the government is part of that process in a very healthy way. And lastly, I think that the top of my mind is also the incentives that we're creating around the environment to kind of pursue and give data to these artificial intelligence models and images, and what other countries and how we can all work together. And that also has me excited, and also is something that we have to work through as a country in terms of challenges and opportunities.
Great, thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those topics. Shreya, we would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat more and learn from others as well today. My name's Shreya. I'm a primary care provider and also a clinical informatics specialist. And I think just personally, I think one of the things that's amazed me about generative AI is how I've seen how some of the tools like ChatGPT have helped me with tasks outside of clinical practice. But I recognize I have a lot to learn about how I even select my own use cases with that. I have to learn about prompt engineering to really maximize how I use it. And so I think similarly, a lot is going to evolve with generative AI applications in healthcare over the next couple of years. I think we have to have such a high bar for that and those applications in healthcare, especially as the technology develops, as we identify more use cases, and as we become more skilled at using and evaluating these tools. I think some of the use cases that I'm most excited to think about exploring are the ones with the highest value, but also the lowest risk, at least to start. And so examples are, how can we augment provider efficiency? I like the analogy of like a co-pilot, so AI scribes, for example. Information retrieval, I think both for individual patient reviews, for chart summarization, but also general medical knowledge retrieval, given just how rapidly evidence is changing and guidelines. And I can see how generative AI could really help me there. And then one of the other areas I'm interested in learning more about is personalized patient education. And I can really envision a lot of exciting applications there.
Wonderful. I'm sure we will dig deeper into those use cases. Deb, over to you.
Hey, Shijin, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'm Dev. I'm emergency medicine faculty at Stanford, and I work with various vision and language models. And I'm also part of a team that helps evaluate whether models should be deployed within the healthcare system, looking at multiple facets, the financial use case, the ethics around it, and the workflow issues that surround any machine learning model that you may want to bring to the bedside. The main thing that that's on my mind when I think about these generative models is the speed at which the field is progressing. It's almost at a dizzying pace. And I find it's really important to keep a focus on the use case. The problems that we had in healthcare are near identical to the problems we had before ChatGPT came out. Like, nothing about that has really changed. And I think keeping an eye on the pain points, figuring out the pain points, it's just as difficult as it was in the pre-generative AI phase as it is right now. And so we struggle with that on a daily basis. And I find, we work with a lot of tools that are evolving. Now I can run these large language models on my own personal laptop. That wasn't even possible a couple of months ago. And it's very exciting, but I want to keep everybody sort of grounded and thinking about, where are the issues and where can we help providers at the bedside and patients and the healthcare system. And so I'm looking forward to kind of digging deeper into some of these ideas.
Thank you. Thanks for keeping us all grounded and with all the exciting advancement. So maybe now first question, let's just pivot to an important topic and ethical implications, as you all mentioned. And what do you see as the most pressing ethical challenges associated with implementing the generative AI in healthcare? Rohini, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think that I'll actually take the end of Deb's conversation point, which was a lot. I find it very interesting. And I think people that have worked in the healthcare space, comparative to other sectors, know that there has lots of times been a lot of promises, and we don't always see the change so quickly, particularly in healthcare, given how siloed it can feel sometimes, whether it's a different healthcare system or a provider and the patient relationship. So a good example is electronic health records. Like we, initially when it first started, everybody was trying to think through how do we make all these systems interoperable, and patients still have yet to feel the interoperability. Providers do as well. They don't feel that connectivity because of a variety of things that, frankly, different vendors came in and had different agreements with different hospital systems and different providers. And so I think exactly what my other panelists have said, we really need to think about, when we think about both responsibility, but also just how is that user going to feel? How is that patient going to feel? Another thing that was touched upon that I find really fascinating and interesting is just when I was talking about the healthy ecosystem involved, I think we really do need to take a step back and look at the landscape right now, which is that the vast majority of access to computing power in order to fund these models, which are frankly very expensive to take huge amounts of data and allow them to iterate upon each other, most of those breakthroughs are happening in the private sector. And so you're seeing large breakthroughs at rapid paces happening, the vast majority. Like, and an example is that the last year alone, there was about approximately somewhere in the 20 to 30 number of breakthroughs in the private sector in terms of foundational models, and you saw only 2 to 3 models in academia. And when you think about the disparity, if you look at where do we expect our breakthroughs to come from in the healthcare space, just in terms of research, a lot of people are looking to NIH funded research that is happening through academic medical centers and other places for, the real bulk of people going after things that they believe will help society. And that may not always be the incentive that the private sector has first and foremost. A lot of times these same startups are in rooms where they're having to pitch to investors that they will be able to show them a return on investment, even in the healthcare space. And so we want to make sure, I think as all of us are thinking through these different challenges, for when we think about how do we have conversations about access, what is responsible between patient and provider, that we actually look at the underlying incentives before we even start having these conversations, because maybe there might be misaligned incentives. And so that's where I would start. But I also think, as the other panelists have pointed out, these conversations around the same inequities in healthcare right now, making sure that we don't exacerbate those through the biases in our data, the tendency to move so fast that we're actually making things harder for people, not easier.
Excellent point. And we're gonna to talk a little bit more about equity later. And Shreya, so what will be some of your thoughts about the most pressing ethical challenges?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think Rohini really set this stage with some of the foundational things that we really will need to think about, incentives, especially as we recognize that a lot of the players in this space are, private sector. In terms of thinking about some of the applications that I've had, some more experience with at least in the outpatient ambulatory medicine side, I think some of the areas that I could anticipate the biggest challenges, one would be in the data. Is the data, representative? Are we going to make sure that the data sets are gathering diverse populations in there, but also access to the tools themselves? So we know that, the data is used to train the models, but then the kind of benefits of these tools, who is going to have access to that, and really thinking thoughtfully about where the disparities lie. I think Rohini brought up a couple of really great ways that we might be able to get ahead of that, thinking about incentives, for example. Some other challenges that I anticipate: trust, I think, both from the healthcare team perspective, but also from our patients. And so how do we get ahead of that? And, thinking about transparency and ways to really get ahead of that. Because I think if we start to lose trust in these tools, then it's going to be really hard to regain those trusts. So before we even start to really have broad deployments of these types of tools, at least, especially I think on the, predictive and the therapeutic side, how can we really find ways to build that trust in? And the last challenge I think I can anticipate is how are we going to regulate all this? Like how are we going to monitor and be able to track in a way that's nimble enough so we can identify if there are biases in the data, if there are disparities that we're creating because of these tools. Who's going to monitor that? How are we going to monitor that? And how are we going to be able to do that in a way that's fast enough so we can, learn from that for future applications?
Excellent. I'm making sure we're going to touch on that, like the data set and also the trustworthy issue, monitor and track. Great. And that?
Yeah, in a similar vein, there's been a lot of talk about the advancements that have happened in the private sector so far. I think one of the biggest ethical problems that we're dealing with is the models that are the most publicly accessible models. Think ChatGPT, think Claude. The details about the underlying model itself, what the model has been trained on, as in what kind of material has this model been ingesting to tell you what it does when you talk to it. And the fine-tuning strategies, they're all opaque. They give some general information, but there's no real details around how they came up with these models. We don't know how these models will perform across various healthcare use cases. And these are the ones that are most easily integrated into some of our work, just because their APIs are available. The companies make an effort to reach out to healthcare organizations and say, hey, would love to help you with this and partner with us. But we still don't know how these models are trained. We don't know what the performance will be across different groups of people. Those ideas, the opacity regarding the underlying training data, and the uncertainty about the performance are definitely related. I see one of the benefits of AI is like the opportunity to automate human-led processes. And we don't want to get into a situation where we deploy a model that has variable performance across certain tasks or groups of people. And by tasks, I mean helping out at the bedside, managing referrals, making patient phone calls, patient education. And by groups of people, I'm not just talking about racial and ethnic groups, I'm also talking about older patients and younger patients and immigrants and patients who don't have enough history in their medical record to make accurate predictions off of. In healthcare, when we have variable performance, this can easily lead to patient harm. And the threshold for AI models in healthcare should be really, really high. And I don't know what the number is. If you ask different people, you'll get different answers. But it's almost like self-driving cars. If you got behind the wheel of a self-driving car and the model statistics told you that it will crash 1 out of every 200,000 times, would you take that risk? I mean, you're talking about maybe a small fender bender versus a huge highway accident. And we don't know enough about these models to kind of deploy them in an automated fashion for sure, at least definitely not in the high risk scenarios. And so we need to do a lot more work in terms of figuring out what the performance is and does it even make sense to jump on the latest model that comes up? So Meta dropped Llama 2 a couple of weeks ago. Is it better than GPT? I don't know. We don't have a holistic way of evaluating these models across healthcare use cases.
Right. I think the challenge for just evaluating the performance of different models in a horizontal way is really, really a big challenge. So I think each of you perspective kind of shed light on the multidisciplinary aspect we must navigate as we integrate those kind of AI tools into our health system. Now I'd like to hone in some specific applications and studies and also collaborations that are currently underway. Maybe, and Shreya, I'll start from you. We've learned that Stanford Healthcare is launching initiatives and using generative AI tools to help with in-basket and document workflows in EHR. These studies aim to assess the potential impact of the AI tools. Could you please share some insights about these pilots at Stanford?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for the question. So both of these pilots are collaborative efforts within Stanford between our IT teams, clinical informatics, the heart team, and then also the data science teams, all playing really critical roles. One thing that I've recognized throughout this work is that the leadership at Stanford really has committed to thoughtful and safe implementation of AI with a rigorous evaluation strategy. But that's also been a work in progress because there is no playbook for us to learn from in terms of what this rigorous evaluation strategy is. So the first pilot, I can speak a little bit more to that because we're farther along on that one. It's the use of a GPT-4 based tool embedded within the EHR MBasket. And Stanford's actually one of the first to pilot this along with UCSD and UW-Madison. What the tool does is it generates draft messages for patient messages that a healthcare team member could then, review, edit. If they'd like to take some of it, they can then use it and then respond. And so this tool was turned on in a pilot phase for about 200 pilot users from primary care and GI across different roles. So providers, including APPs, nurses, clinical pharmacists, for 1 month. And so some of the findings from this I can share. We found higher adoption of draft messages amongst primary care providers and pharmacists, and then amongst GI nurses and APPs. So the specialty providers, we didn't see as high of an adoption. Interestingly, we found no significant change in time spent reading or responding to messages pre or post, but granted, this was 1 month. The survey data also showed a small reduction in perceived mental workload and also a small reduction in burnout. So we have to kind of dig into that a little bit more. And then the other interesting finding was that respondents had high expectations of the usability of the tool before the pilot, but those were either met or exceeded. So I think that was kind of a positive takeaway for this. I want to emphasize these findings are very early. It's a very quick pilot. So there's a lot of little underlying assumptions and nuances, but I think one takeaway for us was if we continue to see no significant change in time in future studies, it may be something we need to revisit. Like we may need to define other metrics of success, like care team wellness, like we're doing with this pilot, but also quality of messages sent, patient experiences. And so hopefully we're going to learn more from this, and then that's going to help guide us on our next steps. The other pilot that we're working on is an ambient digital scribe AI tool, and this is backed also by GPT-4 to generate a draft clinical note. Again, a provider would review this, edit it, see if they like it, and then sign it. And so Stanford's actually the first and only site with this one piloting a fully integrated version of this within Epic and the phone version of Epic. So the plan is for about 50 providers in this pilot, and then we'll do similar types of evaluations like we've done with the MBasket project. As far as big picture lessons learned, I think we've just recognized that we're trying to pioneer through this space. We're really hoping to apply rigorous methods to make sure things are safe, that they're usable, that they're actually useful to the teams that are using them. So that's kind of that value question that we're really thinking about. And so with these two pilots, we're focusing on right now the potential impact on our healthcare team. So burden, burnout, trying to figure out what are those barriers to implementation, and then how can we improve on the tool and how can that inform development of the tool. So we hopefully will continue to learn from these things and have more to share.
Oh, very interesting. Thanks for holding the torch and be like a pioneer in the space. And Dev, and I also know that your recent research offers some insight into our language models' ability to answer some clinical questions that arise during care delivery at Stanford Healthcare. Could you share some findings and thoughts around opportunities and risks with generative models in healthcare?
Sure. So we did something called a functional evaluation, meaning that we actually took questions that clinicians had submitted to a internal data-driven service, and took the same questions, which we already had answers to internally, and exposed the questions to GPT 3.5 and GPT-4. And we took the responses from these two language models and compared it to our internal answer. And the way we did that comparison was we took 12 clinicians and we had physicians grade these answers. And we were grading these answers along two dimensions. One, safety. So were there elements in the response that might cause downstream patient harm? And two, how did the model's answer compare to our internal answer? So I think three big takeaways from that project. One, overwhelmingly, the language model produces safe responses. Now, I'm not endorsing the language model used at the bedside, but at least for the 60 questions that we evaluated, the responses were generally safe. I think there were a few responses where it presented a citation that was completely false. This is the hallucination concept that exists with generative models, but generally safe responses. GPT-4 was definitely better than 3.5. We had more physicians, we had more consensus in that the GPT-4 answers were aligned with our Stanford answer. But most of the time, it was very difficult to compare the answers between our internal answer and the language model answer. And that just goes to show that it's very difficult to take a response that the language model generates and say for sure, this is going to be helpful for everybody who's asking this question. And anybody who's worked in healthcare knows that the truth has to be presented in 20 different ways to 20 different kinds of people. So we have a spectrum of people. We have nurses and we have PAs and we have techs and we have residents and we have interns and attendings and fellows. And then we have patients with variable amounts of medical knowledge. Some are really well knowledgeable about their disease and some have no idea. So that one piece of truth has to be crafted in 20 different ways across an entire many audiences. This is where some of the risks come in. As recently as maybe 6-8 weeks ago, I've been interacting with very modern language models. I'm not going to say who or which ones, but very modern models that say things like diabetic drugs increase blood sugar levels. And that's, if you look at that response, it's quite a fatal mistake to make. And this is as recent as 6 weeks ago. So typically what happens is you're working with the model, you're presenting it questions, you're getting very, very good responses. And every once in a while, it gives you a response that's completely wrong. The citation is wrong. The mistake can vary all the way from, the citation is wrong to a diabetic drug increases blood sugars. And so we don't know what kind of downstream harm this is going to cause. The type of person that would benefit from the answer is not somebody who already knows the answer. If you know the answer, you don't need to go to a language model to get the answer. You are somebody who doesn't know the answer to that question. So if you get a wrong answer, it can cause downstream harm. So when we talk about questions providers have at the bedside, I don't think generative models are ready for prime time automated use. As in, you cannot rely on ChatGPT to help you make therapeutic decisions. But that's not the only use case that we grapple with in healthcare. We have a lot of other administrative backend processes that if we get it wrong, it's fine. Patients are not going to get harmed. We have a Swiss cheese model in medicine. Someone will pick up the error and move on it. An example of this is like a referral management system. So if you want to send a patient to a very specific cardiology subspecialist, say heart failure, but the language model says, oh, send them to a transplant doctor. Somebody is going to pick up on that and rebook the patient for another appointment, and the patient is probably going to do okay. Another project that we're working on in the emergency department is would love to. We have a very complicated admissions grid at Stanford. Certain patients with this type of cancer need to go to this service, and ENT needs to go to this service. If you come in as a trauma, but you only have eye injury, you should be admitted to the ophthalmology service instead of the trauma service. And we have a lot of providers that are kind of rotating through our emergency department as well. So we're working on a system that lets us answer these questions about where these patients should go in an automated fashion without having to look at this gigantic Excel spreadsheet. That is super low risk, because if you page the wrong person to bring your patient into the hospital, they're just going to tell you, hey, just call this other team. You know, it's no risk to the patient, but it can provide a huge administrative benefit. So I'm looking forward to using language models in low risk settings, especially like low hanging kind of administrative use cases. And for the moment, we're staying away from bedside clinical decision support, which means help me treat this patient.
Right. So sounds like the administrative burden kind of like a low-hanging fruit for generative AI at this moment. We're not that mature enough yet to tackle those clinical decision-making use cases. Rohini, I think you have also mentioned this before about like all the breakthrough in the private sectors with all the kind of like academia and government regulation lag behind. And you helped forge a number of public-private partnership in the White House. How do you envision bridging the gap between the private sector's drive to innovation and the government's concerns and public concerns around the generative AI?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I do believe that everyone should play their different role in the ecosystem in terms of, how to create something that's healthy for everyone and a healthy balance between the public and private. What public-private partnerships do ultimately at the end of the day is they send strong signals out to the world that this is something that's really important. And it's something that both the government and the private sector is very invested in. So if you are interested in it, it's a good space to sort of think about. When I think about sort of the concept behind it, if you look at sort of the most recent voluntary commitments that large tech companies have put forward around AI, most of you on here that have read about it in the news would see that nothing was very specific to any sector in and of itself. There was no specificity around healthcare or things like the financial service industry or energy. And so what you have is we're really at the tip of the iceberg. And what I think is really important in the artificial intelligence space is that we sort of look at it with a broad lens and we make this accessible to everybody, because it's going to change so many sectors of society in terms of, as we talk about generative AI and the answers it could provide. So everybody really has a vested interest. This isn't just something that is a tech policy conversation between only people that, spend time with the models themselves. Like, the impact is going to be felt in a lot of different spaces. Now, when we look at healthcare, just specifically, as an example, when I worked on laws around medical mobile applications and the FDA regulation of those. At the time, this was when everyone was concerned about how we're using apps on our phone to determine, what we should do on healthcare. The FDA took largely a risk-based approach. So when, there is a big difference between using your Weight Watchers app to calorie count versus an app that might be taking images or your information and telling you whether you you may be at risk for cancer, or you may have a history that would lead one to maybe want to make actual medical decisions about themselves, and putting that information in the hands directly of consumers. And really, that's where a lot of time was spent around. Really, what is that risk that you're allowing somebody without the intervention of a physician or a provider to really intervene and say, well, let's discuss this. We can't, we don't want you acting without some intermediary that you can go to that is trained to talk to about this. And I think that it's something, whether it's both on the regulatory side or the payment side, that there's a lot that all the healthcare agencies that when we look at what regulates healthcare really have to grapple with. I mean, even really figuring out and making sure that they themselves have the personnel and the talent to help them work through how to think through a risk-based approach, and also how to when there's new and innovative technologies, how to properly pay for that. Both of those things are going to be something that the government is really going to be grappling with, while at the same time there will be, I'm sure, use cases of people trying to mislead and defraud. And then the question is, how does the government respond to those? And how do we get back to creating a healthy balance for people in the healthcare space?
Great. I think talking about a regular FDA regulation and building on that and your comments, we all know that current regulation don't require medical AI companies to conduct comprehensive evaluation on safety and equity. And many companies they don't do those kind of tough studies on their own. Could third-party organization help to oversee this type of work? And do you envision a possible structure to create an independent body dedicated to assessing AI safety and equity issues and kind of grant a quality seal?
Well, I think that I'll let the other panelists go as well, but I do think that any and all ideas should be out there around what might be the best in this space. The FDA themselves have used third-party accreditors for lots of different use cases and things that they have to regulate. At the same time, what's really important to remember is that I believe it was something Dev said, just the industry that is really out there to evaluate any of these models is so nascent. We do not have a robust industry of third-party validators on foundational models. It's something, even if you were just having a model and you were using it in the pure tech sense, nothing related to healthcare, and Stanford, at High, there's been a ton of research around when you were even looking at any of the current regulations in place or the EU's regulations and you apply them to the foundational models, most of them weren't meeting the standards. And so it showed that when evaluating these models, that they're not meeting the necessary standards that are happening in other regions' regulations. But there's also not a robust network of evaluators out there that can easily just sort of figure out how to, give us this sense of trustworthiness that we're all hoping for on these models. And so that's something that I think it's definitely going to be this continued conversation around how best to do that.
Dev, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I'm almost reminded of this really weird quote I hear every time there's some sort of an accident that like regulations are written in blood. And I don't want to get into a scenario where we look back on the development of healthcare AI, whether it's generative or non-generative, and we look at these seminal moments, and then that's when we react and come up with rules and guardrails. I think, as humans, we've experienced our fair share of like disasters and problems, and we should use the learnings from other industries, for example, the airline industry, and create guardrails around these new technologies. Because every time a new technology comes out, certain people get harmed, and then we figure it out, and then humanity moves on. And we can probably do it better this time. Not saying, and I don't think anybody has really figured out how to do it, but there should be a big investment in this direction, both in the public and in the private sector space.
Great.
Yeah, not too much more to add. I think that I feel like the types of things that would be helpful would be maybe a playbook or frameworks or tools that could really help organizations maybe then have the information that they need to know, how to evaluate. I do feel like the experience that we've had with EHRs, for example, is that, a single technology can vary significantly. So because we know that everyone's going to have to kind of fit the tools to apply to their specific use cases or really fit for their local applications, there will be some need for this sort of information to be fluid and so generalizable enough that people can, learn from it. So that's why I like this concept of maybe playbooks or having some sort of framework. So the National Academy of Medicine has put out a equitable technology framework, and some of the things that they've spoken to in that are things like reorienting the culture of innovation towards equity or incentivizing equity, expanding participation. So I think really digging into these more foundational principles, even what Rohini kind of goes back to the very beginning of these incentives, I do feel like we need to be cautious about adding too many steps in the middle, because I think we've seen examples of how too much bureaucracy can then lead to some of these extra burden in the form of clicks on, frontline workers. And so really finding that balance where we want to make sure that we're doing this in a safe and equitable way, but also trying to find that balance so we don't make things extra burdensome for no significant added value. So I think that's the challenge that I anticipate.
Right. Sure. I also want to come back to, as promised, the ethical issue raised before about like data set. Generative AI, as we all know, that they often produce this content based on data from dominant cultures. For example, a Stanford study found that machine learning algorithms trained on US patient data were just disproportionately trained on cohorts from California, Massachusetts, and New York. How can the research community address the potential bias and limitations to ensure that this kind of AI solutions are equitable and generalized effectively across diverse populations? Maybe another playbook?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that there's a lot that we can hopefully all have shared learning so that organizations can really say, okay, we don't have to all reinvent the wheel and go figure out each of these components on our own. We can have shared learnings and be able to refer to some type of playbook. So I think some of the components that might help. So one is data governance. And I'm thinking about a JAMA paper that our chief data scientist, Shreya Shah, helped with recently. And one of the questions I was asked is like, are large language models being trained with the relevant data and the right kind of data? And I think that really helped summarize to me this idea of representative data, also thinking out more open source data sets being available so that it helps with transparency and really like proactive bias monitoring. And then another place that I anticipate could help is risk assessment. Back to, again, what Dev and Rohini mentioned, like we may not have to be as worried about some of those lower risk applications, but especially in the higher risk applications, I think there we can learn from other places. Like the EU, for example, has an AI Act where they've already started to think about stratifying systems based on that type of like high versus low risk. I think co-development will probably be another key point to your specific part about like the diverse populations. And if we're thinking about applying these in diverse populations, we really need to think about direct engagement with these diverse communities, have them at the table to co-design the AI workflows. I always say it's not the tool and the technology necessarily, it's really the workflows and like how you integrate that tool into the workflow. That has to be with local stakeholders. We have to explore these assumptions that could then contribute to mistrust or bias, but we won't really know what we don't know unless we're actually engaging people in the community in that work. And I think the last thing that I'll probably keep kind of coming back to is just evaluate, and how we evaluate and how that reinforms and kind of create this feedback cycle almost, so that what we learn can then go back both into the data, but then it can also go back into that co-development and kind of workflow redesign. So we could say, okay, well, we found that this tool and this workflow actually didn't move the needle. It didn't really meet the outcome or process measures we were hoping for. Let's think about how we might want to redesign. Or we found that this tool and there was bias or it increased some disparities, then that may need to go back to kind of the data set and how that model's trained.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a whole bunch of questions in the chat. So let me just add those into this conversation, which has been great. The first is a question for Rohini. I guess as we're listening to this, one of the questions here is about transparency. And so in general, do you have to disclose that you're using these tools when you're taking care of me as a patient? Do we require any reporting? Like we talked about, in terms of has the algorithm been tested for bias or quality?
Yeah, I mean, at the heart of this, it is very complex in healthcare. And I think everybody that's listening in knows some of the rules and regulations like HIPAA that we have in place. They also, are acutely aware of some of the liability issues that we face in healthcare as well with providers and their conversations with their patients. And so, right now I think you could find some use cases that ethically present a real challenge, which is, when physicians maybe as AI models become more standard, if a physician disagrees with that standard of care in the moment, or if, who's then liable, are you more at risk because you went against the AI model? But if the AI model is what you went with, and then there was a bad outcome, where is the liability then? I think there are going to be real challenges. So I think transparency, certainly if you think about it from the patient perspective, patients are always going to want more transparency, and that's natural and that is normal. But even for the provider themselves, I think, Shreya and Dev mentioned the importance of even as providers knowing, well, how did they come to this conclusion, is really important. But I think as, back to how we sort of think about, it's moving so fast, and these conversations about, what is the disclosure to the patients? What is the disclosure to the provider? And how do we grapple with feeling comfortable? I also think globally too, just like taking a step back, the United States, like if you look at other areas like the EU and China, like we have a much more open relationship about giving over data sometimes to larger companies in which to use. And so, but it is specific when we think about healthcare, there are a lot of protections in place that can also be barriers too, to what I think some of the panelists are talking about, and what the questions have been around, why can't we just make everybody use everyone's data? And we have a lot of barriers in laws in place largely to protect patients. So we're going to have to grapple with some of that as we try and get more transparency in there.
All right. Well, we got a couple of questions that have been very technical, so I'm going to go to Dev and Shreya. There are two that are kind of, one's a recurring theme about interoperability and asking the question whether large language models will help with interoperability. I answered one of the questions, but would love to hear your thoughts. And another goes to data architecture and LLMs. Right now, the data architecture around the hospital, we've got a question here about blockchain, but I'm going to generalize that to personal health records. For this technology to move forward, do we need to revisit the architecture? So the first question about interoperability, and the second question about architecture.
Let me take that second question about architecture. I also see another question here about open source models, whether they have a place in healthcare. So yes, I think the architecture or the model or the mechanism by which we get to the final answer and help the patient or help the provider make a better decision, help the patient get educated. I don't think healthcare is an area that need one particular technology. I think there is some frustration in that healthcare moves slowly, and it should move slowly. I see a question here about the recency of the data with the underlying large language models. I'm assuming, and like ChatGPT is an example, like the training data ends at September 2021. But my response to that is like evidence that we use to treat patients at the bedside also moves at a really glacial pace. So we're not particularly affected by if a model is training data ended 1 month ago versus 1 year ago, and maybe 10 years ago would be a problem. But the architecture that gets us to the final answer helps the patient out, helps our providers, helps our organization. That's the one where I would say that healthcare is on board with. We're not blocking or like married to any particular solution here.
Thanks, Dad. I can try to take the interoperability question. I saw, Kevin, what you put in the chat, and I think I very much agree with you that I don't see AI alone being able to tackle or solve the issue of interoperability. I think that it will be able to help, but I still think that we're going to have like humans kind of there in that workflow too. So almost just continuing to extend that analogy of like in healthcare, I feel like for the most part, except for some of the maybe very low-hanging, low-risk operational tasks, a lot of these tasks are probably going to have to involve, let's put AI to this, but then let's have it, reviewed or confirmed by a human. Examples of this that we've run into at Stanford on the informatics side are, what's our risk threshold to allow outside information to kind of come in and maybe tell us that someone got a test, but then we all know that there's nuances in how something could look or be discreetly populated in the electronic health record. So I think it comes back to this risk kind of consideration. Vaccines are a great example of, I think, a evolution in the positive movement in interoperability, where we're now getting a lot of vaccine data transferred through the California Immunization Registry and also nationally. And I think it's gonna help, but I don't think it's gonna be a magic bullet per se.
Great. Well, we got people frantically answering some of these questions. Rohini, we're going to go back to the top with you. We've been talking about this idea of value and moving away from patient volume to value. So I'm going to generalize this question from Roger Fowler. Do you see that LLMs or this technology more generally is going to give us new pathways to build a different experience for patients, like other than having to come to my office to see me?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope across a lot of industries, and I wouldn't say just healthcare, I mean, the hope is that this technology, you hear all the time about doctors, nurses burning out, about how much time they have to spend on things that aren't what they went to school for and not the initial reason why they went, which was a lot of it really around the patient. But they find themselves getting pulled away more to like argue with insurance companies, to be dealing with paperwork, to be doing their notes. And it's all things that eventually lead to just less joy in terms of what they get to work on. That being said, I think then if I'm putting on my like former government hat, we also have to think about how we're going to pay for that kind of experience, because right now things are much more, they're not done. Payment is not really driven around this amazing experience with the patient and taking time with them. Any primary care physician can tell you that. But it is really important that these models are used to supplement in a way that I hope not just makes it better for the patients. Now, to be fair, they may come in with a lot more theories as to what condition they may have, which I think the physician will have to work through. But at the same time, I think, things that then give them more confidence and hopefully can drive them to the efficiency around the patient experience, which is what they want, I think is a really great outcome that could happen as a result. And I think you could see that across a lot of industries, that people that implement AI within their practice or within their the work that they're doing may be able to hopefully we'll see less burnout, better patient experiences on both ends.
Great. Well, we've got a couple more minutes. We still have a bunch of questions that we didn't answer, but let's see if we can get one question, I'm going to, again, riff off one of the presenters. If actually I used this use case recently. So if ChatGPT writes my note and then the insurance company complains about my documentation, is there actually a source of truth? As we go forward, if we just have one bot fighting against the other bot. Shreya, you're nodding your head.
I just, because I've heard this analogy of this battle ensuing, or kind of this AI beats AI. And I do think that one question I have is, are things going to be fair? It will be interesting to see how things play out, and hopefully there will be, fairness of AI on both sides of this. But also just thinking about how, if AI helps somebody in their task so that if they can, be more efficient, or helps increase their capacity to do that task, and it's in a safe way, I think that we'll just start to see a lot more of those types of applications. But I know I'm a little bit nervous about some of the things that might come out of this as well.
This is dangerous. I kind of feel like NPR has that last second kind of thing, but they give their panelists a minute to think about the answer. So if you had to think about one use case where you're like, boy, can this thing just solve this problem for me? Is there a use case that comes to top of mind? Just like, in an ideal world that this technology could really solve a problem. Deb?
I've thought about this a lot, actually. So it may be unfair for me to go, but in the emergency department, when we see patients with diseases that are newly diagnosed to them, so we get labs, we get imaging, we tell them they have pancreatitis or gallstones or something like that. Everybody approaches that diagnosis with a different set of information. Like, they all went to school in different places, they all know different things about medicine. Maybe they don't know enough. There's also a healthy level of fear and anxiety in the department. And so invariably what happens is, when we send these patients home, we send them home frequently with a boilerplate information. Here's your information about gallstones. And everybody who goes home with gallstones gets the same exact piece of information. And I would love to tune that information to the patient with regards to their education level and their, how much they know about medicine and what kinds of questions that they have. And I'd love to take that and say, hey, when you're at home and, the anxiety is a little bit less and you're a little bit more comfortable, and now you have 300 questions about what we sent you home with, you should, open up your app, go to the Stanford GPT app, talk to it, and it's going to answer all your questions for you. And so the next appointment you have with your general surgeon or your primary care physician will be that much more productive.
Well, and if that's true, and we'll hear the answer next time on Wait, Don't Tell Me. But thanks. Now, I totally agree with you. One of the things these models do is write. They write really well. And if we can get them to not hallucinate, they could do things like translate to language levels, translate to dialects that are incredibly challenging for us in the current environment. Well, I'm recognizing that we're at time. Unfortunately, this could go on. It'd be great to go on for a lot longer. I really want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and Shixin Shu for moderating this session. Again, Shixin's a graduate of our Master's of Science in Clinical Informatics program. I'm Kevin Schulman. I'm the director of the MCiM program. And again, on behalf of the MCiM program and all of our staff, I want to thank you for joining us and participating in this conversation today. Thanks so much.